Welcome to our third episode of the Out of the Box talk here at mediaBOX. This is the last episode of my conversation with Brian Jin, head of the AI project here at mediaBOX. We dive deep into working with brand new open source code, how ChatGPT helped coding and integration, and why every creative has to adapt to the disruption of AI. What are your thoughts? Which paths are we going to follow?
So I think that is quite a positive message. The two main paths that we've been following, I would hope that we continue following those because I think those are pretty useful. So for example, we currently have a lot of demos and proofs of concepts of how to categorize videos and how we could have an interesting pipeline when ingesting videos before any human lays their eyes on it. But this needs to be set into actual motion, right? This is still just an idea. This is still just a proof of concept. The actual building of such a pipeline is another task entirely, because this needs to really work. When videos come in, they need to be ingested, they need to be edited. There cannot be any errors or any debugging going on right then and there. This needs to be a working pipeline, which needs to work with thousands of gigabytes of data. And actually building up such a working system with all the necessary loops, testing out what is useful, what isn't, that is an entire different project, which has different struggles entirely. So I would hope that this project will get set up now. And also obviously these sort of more creative, explorative stuff that I've been doing. It is all nice and well that I've got it running on my laptop and that I'm trying stuff out, but it's not much use if it's in my head and I'm just showing people cool, interesting videos. This technology, this know-how needs to diffuse into the company and not just stay in my head. So personally, I'm not someone with much of a creative background. I would hope that someone more creatively would set out to use these new tools in conjunction with old tools. So not just press generate like this and hope that this spits out something well, but combine this with an actual storyboard, combine this with perhaps more traditional video editing and all that stuff to make something useful. It needn't be something that is immediately sold. It can just be like an experiment. Like say we have a project, 2 weeks, someone more creative tries to work on some sort of video that sort of involves generative AI. They just try to create something interesting. And in that process, there's a lot of learning, experimentation going on. And perhaps in a future task, in a future project, some company knocks at our door and asks, hey, we would like something more experimental, something more wild. And maybe then this know-how has already been generated. And while the first video wasn't useful, now we have the capability to do something useful and something that not many companies can do. So I would hope that these main paths will be followed.
So you've been working on this project for like almost 3 months now. What do you think was the greatest disappointment that you stumbled over during these 3 phases?
We were pretty lucky in this project that there were things that did not work out, but there were fewer than there could have been. So most stuff did eventually work out. But I think something that I had to realize is that I guess an issue that is called, that you could call like domain specificity. So at least for this 3-month period, there was sort of a limit on how much we could do with AI models. To be more specific, this amount of time that we have and the resources that we have would not have been sufficient to actually train AI models ourselves or to fine-tune models ourselves. This was not in the scope of this 3 months. And so that forced us to use pre-trained models and models that are available online. And that always has the issue that what someone has trained already might not exactly match the exact task that we have. A very common problem whenever dealing with machine learning. So while, for example, I talked about the face analysis before, There are quite a few open source face analysis models out there, but most of them, if not all of them, like those that are readily available, were trained on faces that look perfectly straight into the camera and are perfectly lit. If you have a face that is perfectly straightly looking into the camera and is perfectly lit, there is really not an issue to determine a rough age of that person and all that. As soon as you have, however, actual footage, which we are actually working with, footage from, for example, a fairground, where the face might not be perfectly lit, or where the face is not perfectly straightly looking into the camera, but it's just slightly at an angle. As soon as you have those cases, these models do not work as well, or sadly in some ways just stop working altogether, because that is not what these models were trained for. I assume that if we trained our own models with actual footage that we gathered ourselves and labeled ourselves, with faces that are at a slight angle, with faces that are slightly darker and not perfectly lit, that we could train working models that work for us. But as it is right now, without fine-tuning or training any stuff ourselves, we are limited to existing models, which forces us to use the models in a specific way. It is not looking at a problem and then finding a solution. It is more like finding a solution online and trying to figure out if we have a problem that can be solved with that solution. It is sort of working backwards. Yeah, and that was a bit disappointing to find out, because obviously you would like to find a solution and then find the perfect matching, the other way around. You would want to have a problem and find the perfectly matching solution, but that is just not how things work out sometimes, sadly.
Yeah. So what was your biggest surprise, the big, or maybe the biggest moment of happiness, breakthrough maybe?
I think the biggest breakthrough was just how I was scared at the beginning that I would struggle a lot with the code, that I would not get anything running at all, or that by the end of the 3 months I would only be able to get like 3 models running for some demonstration purposes, which would not be sufficient to actually have a working overview. And while I was a bit slow to work with it at first, it turns out that ChatGPT and GPT-4 are very great at working with code. And even for someone with me who is not a traditional computer scientist, having an actual AI helping you work with code about AI turned out to be immensely helpful and allowed me to very quickly work with the code. Like whenever I had an error message, I would consult the usual sources. I would consult documentation, I would consult Stack Overflow. But I could also just copy the code into something like ChatGPT and ask it what is going wrong here. And astoundingly, ChatGPT gave pretty good options most of the time. And the learning curve was also a lot faster for me than I expected. I thought that maybe I wouldn't learn that much in this little time. I was scared that that might happen. But actually, within only a few weeks, I got pretty used to this sort of code. And also I got astoundingly used to working with code without documentation. I sort of gained the ability to just interpret code without knowing what the author was thinking, actually. That turned out to be a very useful ability.
And when you look more outside of the box, outside of this project, what do you think was your most important learning about artificial intelligence and applying artificial intelligence on a practical level?
Well, I mean, as the saying usually goes, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, nothing is like the theory. And this was definitely a key learning for me, because while in theory, a lot of this should be easy and there shouldn't be too much of a hurdle just getting things to work, it turned out that in practice, oftentimes the complicated new stuff was not the issue. It was the traditional debugging, actually getting something to work, working with environments you haven't worked with, actually getting data from point A to point B, sort of working with APIs. It was always the traditional stuff that was more painful to work with. And I just learned a lot about actually how to work with this sort of stuff in theory and in practice, not just in theory. And that was definitely a huge learning for me.
Do you think as a creative person or company, it is possible to ignore the coming of AI in any way?
This is obviously a very heated question in some sense. I think ignoring any sort of technical development just is not that smart. I think you can do it, especially say you are in an top-notch, incredible 0.001% creative person. I don't think much is going to change for that person, even in the next 10, 20, 30 years perhaps, because just this level of human ingenuity, I believe, is something that we value a lot as humans, right? That is not something that we want to make away with. But if it is something a bit more basic than that, say if a company, and not a massive company, but a smaller company, for example, right now wants to have a logo, I think this is something where the pressure of AI is definitely felt. Whereas in the past, some freelancer who draws logos, who designs logos, where this was a very safe job, because other than a human, no one can design a logo. This is definitely something I think where the pressure can be felt, because there, with just a generic logo, let's say, for a very young starting company who does not want to pay too much money, there just no longer is that much incentive to pay a human if for a lot less labor and a lot less money, you can generate a logo that is good enough, right? So I think a lot of this good enough work, unfortunately, just really cannot be ignored, that technology is good enough, right? It is not necessarily top-notch, but it's in a lot of cases good enough. And that is where I think it definitely cannot be ignored in the creative industry.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sitting down with us and giving insights into the project. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah. And thanks for working in the project. It was really, still is for the next 2 weeks, a really fun thing to work on, honestly. Thank you so much for watching. This was the last episode of my conversation with Brian. Next time, we talk about our social media activities. As we plan to make the out-of-the-box talk a frequent format, we will discuss a number of different topics here. I hope to see you next time.